Great. So my name is Alex Wright. I'll just introduce myself briefly. My day job is I work as the director of research at Etsy. In previous life, I worked at the New York Times, where I managed the user experience team for about 6 years. And then before that, I worked at various agencies, startups you've never heard of, and so forth. But I'm not going to talk about any of that work today. And what I want to do today is take a little bit of a left turn. And what I'm particularly interested in talking about today are, not projects that have gotten built, which is really largely why we're here today, is to celebrate some great work that's been done. But I want to talk a little bit about those projects that haven't gotten built. And in a way, you could say this talk is sort of a defense of vaporware. I feel like vaporware has gotten kind of a bad rap lately. There's sort of this meme out there in the UX world that ideas are cheap and execution is what really matters. And and I get that argument, but I want to push back on that a little bit, and the way I want to do that is by taking a little bit of a historical view of things and introducing you to some ideas that preceded the world that we live in today that are maybe not as well understood or as well known as they could be, and to look at these as examples of, I think, what you might call Platonic objects, or sort of idealized concepts that I think have had a lasting influence on the way things ultimately have played out. And I think it's worth, I think in the sort of internet world, there's a bit of a lack of kind of historical awareness around what we do. We tend to be a little bit fixated on the future and on what the next shiny new thing is. And I'd just like to invite you to, today to maybe take a step back and try to, open your mind to the possibility of some earlier precursors of, of hypertext in the web that might spark some new thinking about ways we could think about the problems some of us are trying to solve today. So this is one of those visualizations of the web. This is kind of a network diagram that sort of represents the topology of the internet. So there's lots of stuff out there. There's no particular central organizing structure to it. It just kind of happened, really. And for a lot of us, the experience of it is something like this, right? So, cheap laugh, okay? So, but the web has been around in its sort of current incarnation since the early 90s, but there's a longer heritage to the development of networked information systems, and I want to kind of introduce that to you a little bit and talk about some possible reference points that might be interesting. So the one kind of concept car design that a lot of people know, I'm curious, does this look familiar to anybody? Yeah, a few folks, yeah. So this is sort of often cited as one of the conceptual forerunners of personal computing and hypertext. It's a diagram of a machine called the Memex that was first proposed in 1945 by a guy named Vannevar Bush, who was a very influential scientist during World War II. He was an advisor to President Roosevelt. And he wrote this essay called As We May Think, where he talked about this idea of a machine that could be used primarily by researchers to sort of draw connections between different topics. The idea was it all ran on microfilm, and you could have basically a tool that would allow you to pull up an article on one topic and then pull up an article on another topic and sort of draw connections between them, or what he called links. So this essay proved to be quite influential. It went on to be read pretty far and wide. People like Doug Engelbart, J.C.R. Licklider, some of the, eventually Ted Nelson, the people who really kind of paved the way for hypertext and eventually the web to take shape. Really, there's a pretty clear paper trail that you can trace back to this essay. So, so this is, I think, and the interesting story here is that Bush never intended to build this thing. He had actually tried to build something like this in the 1930s and was frustrated by the limitations of the available technology at the time. He was not able to solve some of the kind of thorny index problems and some of the mechanical engineering problems. And eventually, he just kind of threw up his hands and said, this is not getting me anywhere. What I really need to do is talk about an ideal state that might exist with future technology. And the result of which is, all of the, he was himself a prolific inventor. He was a mechanical engineer. He created all kinds of things, most of which have been completely forgotten. The only, concept that really had any lasting impact was the one that never got built, right? So this is, I think, a great example of very influential vaporware that had a pretty wide-ranging impact. But Bush was not the first guy to think along these lines. As early as the 19th century, people were starting to think about the possibilities of networks, things like telegraphs and early experiments with electricity and pneumatic tube networks and things were starting to take shape. People were starting to see that something interesting was happening here, that networks were taking shape and that There were sort of early forms of electronic communication starting to take shape. People were starting to think about this. One of the really interesting, I think, conceptual forebears of this stuff was a guy named Albert Robida. He was a French novelist who wrote a book in 1883 called The 20th Century. And it revolved around this device called a telephonoscope. That's what he called it. And the idea is it would be a screen-based mechanism that would allow you to pull up words and images, and it would be connected to a network. And these are sort of some of his, he was a novelist and an illustrator, and there's some of his illustrations of what it might look like. So the idea would be that you could have these big kind of displays with kind of audiovisual material. A gentleman could come home after a hard day's work and turn on his telephonoscope, I guess, plus ça change, I guess. He also imagined this idea that you could have audio broadcasts. So this was an idea of people being on a subway car in Paris, and they could have little earphones where they would be plugged in to catch the latest news or popular novels or music broadcasts. So it was kind of like, sort of analog, podcasting kind of thing. So this is a very interesting time, the late 19th century. A lot of things were changing. Industrialization was happening. Networks were starting to happen. And people were starting to contemplate, new ideas about how information could be organized and distributed. There was a guy named Charles Cutter, who was a well-known librarian, an American librarian. And he wrote this essay, also in 1883, called The Buffalo Public Library of 1983, where he started to imagine what a library could look like in the future. So he came up with this crazy idea of a keyboard that was connected to a wire that you could use to pull up images of books that could be displayed on a screen and then sort of sent back into a central repository. Other people started to think along these lines as well. The English novelist H.G. Wells was really pretty intrigued by this idea. He wrote a number of essays over the years that were eventually collected in a book called The World Brain, where he described this idea of a kind of global networked encyclopedia. It was very much like a Wikipedia kind of idea that anyone could contribute to, and that would have, everyone in the world would have a user ID. He kind of looked at the whole problem of authentication and identity management and thought about, he had a much better idea of how it could all work. And the idea would be that anybody could then access this this repository, and he imagined that eventually, all human thought would be connected in this network that would be available to anyone in the world. So there were other folks who were kind of speculating about this. Even Mark Twain, he wrote one of his lesser short stories called From the London Times of 1904, where he introduced this idea of what he called a limitless distance telephone. It was very much a similar idea of a terminal, a terminal that you could use to pull words and images and get updated on anything that was going on in the world. So these were a few early concepts that were floating around. But a lot of this was just pretty speculative stuff. People weren't really trying to build this stuff. But one guy that did try to at least begin to attempt to build something like this is a fellow not many folks have heard of, a guy named Paul Otlet. He was a Belgian guy who worked in the early 20th century mostly. And kind of the sort of elevator pitch about Paul Otlet is that he actually invented something very much like the internet in the 1930s, and was promptly forgotten in the midst of World War II. He died during the war, and a lot of his work was forgotten and never translated into English. But some of the ideas he had, I think, were pretty provocative and are very, I think, useful kind of reference points for thinking about the way information could be structured in a networked world. This diagram sort of illustrates some of his basic ideas. He had this concept that you could take information that was stored in books and sort of extract it and store it on index cards. And the basic idea was to sort of go beyond just kind of cataloging books on a shelf, but to actually index the contents of those books, almost like a search engine, and to go in there and sort of apply a coding system and a linking system that would let you then draw connections between different documents and then allow people to recombine them in interesting kinds of ways. So, like I say, this was not just a concept. He actually started to build something along these lines. He got some funding from the Belgian government, and he initiated this project that was called the Universal Bibliography, which eventually grew to contain over 15 million index cards with little bits of information on them. He hired a staff of people. You could actually send in a query via a telegraph for a small fee, and the staff would then consult the catalog and would then pull up an answer to your query and send it back to you, pretty much a search engine. And he collected all of these interesting gizmos and devices, telecommunications equipment. All of this started to take shape. He started to think beyond the the idea of just a bibliography or a library, he actually started to build an actual physical representation of all this stuff. It became a giant museum. It was meant to be a world museum that eventually took up 150 rooms in a Belgian government building, where he collected information on all kinds of different topics. And the idea was it was kind of a learning museum. It wasn't like what you might typically think of as a museum, like a place where you see art or interesting artifacts. The idea was to use it as a real active learning tool that would allow anybody to explore a whole range of different topics. And so he worked with some graphic designers and his own library staff to create these very interesting kind of interfaces. I think have a real kind of hypertext kind of quality to them. So the idea was that you could enter this museum and sort of pick a topic, and then you would have these kind of introductory diagrams that kind of combined words and images and introduced you to the basic concepts. And then you could use these as kind of jumping off points to then go deeper into any topic by using this classification system he developed that would let you then kind of explore the whole collection. He also played around with other kind of crazy, like kind of Rube Goldberg kind of interfaces, like this, kind of like mechanical interfaces and tools for organizing information. And as he started to develop his ideas, he started to see, you know, in the early 20th century, things like, you know, telephone lines, radio, moving pictures, audio recordings were starting to come into focus, and he started to sort of expand his vision and think, well, what if you could develop a tool that could accommodate all these different kinds of media and actually catalog and collect all that stuff and then make it available over a network, over an electronic network that people could interface with via screen, sort of sitting in their living rooms. So he started to think pretty deeply about this. He also saw possible applications for education. For example, a university could broadcast lectures to a large audience, potentially limitless audience. You could have interfaces for transmitting. He imagined transmitting the taste of smell or taste over the web. You could have the right kind of way of marking that up. And he imagined something like a workstation, like a terminal that could sit in somebody's house. And the idea would be that this would be connected via a telegraph and would have a radio receiver that you could then use to kind of build a very personalized kind of collection of information on any topic that interested you. This is actually an artist in Belgium actually tried to recreate this thing from his drawings a few years ago and looked something like this. So as you know, he continued to think about this, he really started to think about a sort of whole systems design that was beyond just a kind of information retrieval tool. He saw this as part of a very utopian kind of idea that there would be kind of a governing body managing this whole thing that would actually be part of a new world government with this kind of centralized collection at its core. And his idea was that eventually, you know, there would be some sort of you know, governing body that would unite and sort of manage all the world's information and make it freely available to anyone in the world. I think one of the interesting aspects of Otlet's concept was that there was almost no commercial activity taking place. He really didn't envision anybody buying or selling things. You know, he didn't really envision any kind of particular social networking features, although he did think you could have like the ability to kind of applaud or sing in the chorus, as he put it, kind of like you could like things, but he didn't really envision this sort of person-to-person aspect of things. And he definitely didn't envision it as a tool for making money. You know, he really saw it as much more of a utopian idea for like making information freely available and helping to solve a lot of the world's problems through creating a kind of level playing field for information to be shared. And in his later years, he started to really kind of glimpse something very much like the world we live in today. He started to imagine wireless communication happening. He started to imagine this kind of network circling the globe. And really, by the time he died, he was really envisioning something that's really not far off from the world we live in today, although it differed in some fairly important respects. But then, you know, as I mentioned, you know, he died in the middle of World War II, and his work was largely forgotten for many years, but it's just kind of recently, I think, coming back into focus. And I think provides an interesting reference point that suggests some interesting alternative ways of thinking about some of the problems that we're dealing with today on the web, like the fact that, you know, it's very difficult to organize information in a coherent way across, like, you know, multiple different domains or areas. There's you know, a lack of kind of a coherent sort of organizing scheme at work, and he had some pretty deep insights about how something like that could work. So he also collaborated with a number of other people. Well, I don't have time to talk talk about in much depth a guy named Patrick Geddes, who had some interesting ideas around what he sort of these kind of conceptual models for organizing information. He created these things that he called thinking machines. The idea was these were kind of tools for drawing connections between different topics and then making those available in a accessible way to people so that they could also kind of orient themselves to a particular topic space. Here's another example. He also worked with an interesting guy named Hendrik Anderson, who was a sculptor who had some interesting ideas about building a world city. The idea of this would be like a new world capital, which was eventually he imagined it would be where like the League of Nations would be headquartered. And he and Otlet actually worked together very closely on that and tried to explore how this kind of idea of organizing the world's information would affect the shape of like governing systems and larger organizational structures that could help provide a kind of a sort of a new world order, you could say, very utopian kind of idea. Another contemporary of Otlet was a guy named Emanuel Goldberg, also largely forgotten. He was working in the 1930s at a company called Zeiss Icon in Germany, and he was working in this emerging technology of microfilm, and he developed a pretty interesting tool for basically indexing microfilm. The idea was using kind of light sensors and a sort of like punch card technique. You could index topics on microfilm and then create tools for querying against a body of microfilm. It was very much like a search engine kind of idea. Unfortunately, this work came to a halt also in World War II. He was persecuted by the Nazis and had to leave for Palestine and kind of stopped work on this project, which seemed to bear potentially a lot of promise. There is some speculation that the work that he did may have indirectly influenced some of the work that Bush eventually did that led to the Memex and so forth, although it's hard to find the direct paper trail there. But in the years after the war, the history of computers and information systems really became largely an Anglo-American kind of story, and that's the story that most of us know to the extent that we're aware of the history of technology. It's the sort of post-war history of computing is largely one that's told from an Anglo-American perspective through people like J.C.R. Licklider at MIT, who was the architect of the original ARPANET, which he originally described as, he called it an intergalactic network. And actually what he described was also a kind of vaporware. It was really, he was kind of joking that there would be something like that. Although his idea of an intergalactic network, what he really meant was like 5 computers that would be scattered around the world. He thought that would probably do the trick. But he was an interesting guy. He was a little bit of a, contrarian thinker. He was a little bit out there. And one of his proteges was a guy named Doug Engelbart, who was a researcher at Stanford Research Institute, funded by Licklider. And he developed one of the really lasting, I think, demos, a demo with just incredible impact. It was called the Mother of All Demos. It was given here in San Francisco in 1968, where he presented this concept of what he called the online system. And it was actually a working demo of a system that included a facility for hypertext linking. You could link one document to another. It had real-time video conferencing. It had a kind of live chat capability. They needed a tool for moving a cursor on a screen, so he invented a thing called a mouse to go with it, which is where the mouse comes from. And it really had a pretty profound impact on the subsequent development of the personal computer, and the sort of early hacker movement in the Bay Area. A lot of like very influential early members of the Homebrew Computing Club were at this demo, and a lot of his collaborators went on to start Xerox PARC, where they invented Ethernet. They invented some of the early concepts for graphical user interfaces. And I think another great example of piece, even though it was a real demo, it was really kind of a concept car design that proved quite provocative and to have kind of lasting influence. So I'm running out of time. I'm briefly just going to mention a couple people that are also worth knowing about. Ted Nelson, famously kind of contrarian, countercultural figure in the high-tech industry, kind of worked on the margins of the computer science industry for many years, but had some really profound ideas about he coined the term hypertext in the 1960s, and spent much of his career building this, specking out this kind of mythical system called Xanadu, which proved to be an apt term because it never really got built, although he's still plugging away at it. Sorry? Really? That was recent, right? Because I know it's had a rocky history, right? So, yeah. But he self-published a lot of books. He was a real kind of child of the 60s. He self-published a lot of interesting, provocative books that he self-published and self-illustrated that are kind of fascinating to read. And I think also, he had just a ton of ideas that have yet to kind of really see the light of day, but in a way his vision is much more sophisticated than the web as it exists today. Which unfortunately I don't have time to get into. It would be a topic for another day, but I encourage you to look into Ted Nelson on your own time. Here's just a quick snapshot of some of his work. This is a concept that he had for a concept he called transclusion, which is kind of a way of deep linking between documents. So, I hope this is at least slightly helpful in sort of introducing some ideas people may not have heard of. I feel like, just to bring it back to the present day, when I look around at a lot of the development that goes on these days, I don't see a lot of this kind of speculative design work going on. And there are a couple of interesting submissions for the awards today that I think were along these lines. But I think as UX designers or people working in this world, I would just encourage us to think more broadly about more sort of idealized representations of what things could become. It's very easy to get into kind of the tactical build, and anyone who's ever worked on a project in this space knows you're always, at the end of the day, you end up making trade-offs and having to bring things into what's feasible within the constraints you're working in. But I think there should be room, and there needs to be room for more forward-thinking kind of speculative design, and I would encourage people to try to find those opportunities and create that space in your own work to think along these lines. So anyway, so I'm out of time. I'll leave it here. If you're interested in any of this stuff, I wrote a couple of books about some of this stuff, and thank you. Am I done? 5 minutes? Okay, I got 5 minutes. So any questions? Nope.
Did you say the name of the Belgian designer who created the universal bibliography?
Yeah, it's this guy. His name is Paul Otlet, O-T-L-E-T. Yep. Anything else? Nope. All right. Well, we'll keep going. Thank you.